Hey guys, I'm your host Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Have you picked up the latest volume of Kowabana, volume 10 yet? If you haven't checked it out yet, do head over to Amazon to pick up your copy right now. We've got creepy curses, human horrors, vengeful ghosts, and much more on display, so don't miss out. We also have a brand new design up in the Kowabana merchandise store. You can check that out at kowabana.store. We have shirts, mugs, stickers, masks, and much more, so do check it out and help support the show at the same time. This week, we're heading back into the countryside and a few more locations you'll definitely want to miss next time you're out and about. First, a certain village has a rice field that the locals refer to as the Snake Paddy, and nobody likes to go near it. Why? And what happens when it's finally paved over and a store built on top of it? Find out in Snake Paddy. This is something that really happened where I live. I live in a countryside city. These days there are less and less rice fields, but there aren't a lot of new houses being built either. The population neither increases nor decreases, and although large department stores are being built on the city outskirts, the small stores around the station are all closing down. The area around my house used to be nothing but rice fields, but after they split the university campus and moved, most of that area got snatched up for buildings. Now it's mostly apartments for students with a few restaurants here and there. There was one rice field in particular that the locals called the Snake Paddy, and in the south corner of this field there was a simple shrine made of bamboo and straw. I saw new offerings left there several times a month. There was chicken inside aluminium foil, and you would think something like that would attract the crows, but there was never any sign that they touched it. I was so curious that I would even take the long way home from elementary school just to check it out. But by the next morning, the offerings were always gone. The area never looked a mess, like wild dogs had attacked it or something, so I guess some people cleaned it each night. I brought this up to my family, but my father was from another area, so he didn't know anything about it. And when I told my mum, she didn't seem to want to talk about it and quickly changed the subject. An elderly farmer owned that particular rice field, and he owned quite a bit of land that he rented out. But that field alone, he and his wife planted each year by hand. It must have been tough, but nobody ever offered to help them, and the mood in the area was that nobody should offer to help either. That was just how it was done. They didn't sell the rice from that field either. They always took it home for personal use. However, that elderly couple soon passed away, and the land was transferred to the university campus before being sold. A large supermarket was then built on that land, which included the Snake Paddy. That couple had several children, but none of them lived in the area anymore, so they sold it and then divided the profits. However, the fact that they sold the Snake Paddy didn't go over so well with the locals. The elderly folks in the neighborhood in particular were unhappy, and they brought the sale up with the neighborhood association. Even my mother said that if they were going to stop using that land to plant rice, then they should at least leave the land itself to die. Of course, she didn't give a reason why, but in the end, the Snake Paddy became part of the parking lot and not the building itself. The supermarket wasn't a big chain store, but a small, locally run store owned by a husband and wife. I met them a few times. They were in their early 50s and started the store with some early retirement money, and the rest apparently put them in considerable debt with the bank. But they were friendly and worked hard. At least, in the beginning. When the supermarket first opened, it held a sale. I went there with my mum, but she parked the car not in the parking lot where the snake paddy had been, but rather on the road nearby. I don't think anything will happen these days, but it's best not to get too close anyway, she said. For the first month or so, I think the supermarket did quite well with the students always dropping in, but then something bad happened. A car in the parking lot caught on fire. It wasn't caused by a cigarette or anything like that, but rather it seemed to be an electrical problem. The car was destroyed and the car next to it was affected as well, but luckily no one was hurt. But then, 2 weeks later, a male university student set himself on fire in the parking lot late at night. He covered himself in gasoline and then lit a match. My mother woke up that night due to the sound of fire trucks and ambulances, so she asked about what happened. There were all sorts of rumors that he had gone mad, that he was suffering from a breakup and such, but in the end, no one knew why he did it. He did the deed close to where the shrine had been in the snake paddy, and after that, there was a black stain on the asphalt that people always stepped around. And of course, nobody parked their cars near there anymore either, because it was creepy. Visitors to the supermarket dropped dramatically after that, and the few people working there part-time also quit one after the other as well. 2 months after they had opened, the owners were the only ones working there. The husband stayed there overnight because he had to stock the store, but compared to when the store first opened, he had lost a lot of weight and was no longer smiling. I had just started junior high around that time, and one Sunday I went to the supermarket to grab some snacks on the way to my friend's house. The wife was working the cash register, and her hair hung limp and oily, like she hadn't washed it. The husband was in the fresh fish section, slicing some fish behind the glass doors. There wasn't a lot of stock on the shelves compared to when they first opened, and I was the only person in the store. Almost all the stock was gathered in the center of the store, and cardboard boxes piled towards the roof in the far corner. There was a window that overlooked the parking lot, but for whatever reason, I didn't want to look in that direction. I picked out a packet of chips or something, and then I heard a thumping sound. It was the sound of the husband cutting fish, but it suddenly sounded a lot more forceful. I walked over to the fresh fish section to look, and I was suddenly assaulted by a terrible smell. It wasn't the smell of rotten food, but rather like a bucket of water full of old cigarette butts. Not that I smoked or anything. The meat and fish on the shelves looked dry and crispy, so I thought they were just old, but when I looked at the expiration dates, I saw they were still new stock. I could see the husband cutting fish behind the glass, but he didn't look in my direction even once. He just kept looking down, focused on what he was cutting and putting all his strength into it. I guessed he was cutting fish, but it was below the glass, so I couldn't see. But he appeared to be holding the fish in one hand as it squirmed, and then he screamed in pain and the thing he was holding flopped about. No doubt about it, I had just seen the head of a large snake. Oh, hell no, I thought, and ran towards the register. I tossed the items I had down, and the wife added them up with zero expression on her face. Then she handed me the receipt and stared right at me. "You're from the junior high, aren't you?" she suddenly said. "When you go to school, can you please tell the other students to stop stealing from us? I've spoken to your principal on the phone, but nothing has changed." The tone in her voice was blunt. I left the store feeling not so great, but then I realized I forgot to buy a drink. I didn't want to go back inside again, so I grabbed a few bottles from the nearby vending machine. Then, inside an empty bottle that was poking out from the full bin beside the vending machine, I saw something squirming and squiggling, like it was forming a ball. I backed away from it and ran, wondering why I had to go through some sort of weird haunted house just to buy a few snacks. I told my mother about what happened at dinner that night. I knew it. It was the snake, Paddy. We have to get ready. 2 weeks later, the husband and wife from the supermarket hung themselves. They took a clothesline to the edge of the parking lot, the spot where the shrine had been and where the man burned himself, and then hung themselves. Rumours soon spread that because it was a clothesline, their feet were still dragging on the ground at the time too. The supermarket was abandoned after that. The building was left standing and it became something of a ghost spot that the locals avoided, especially the car park. I've heard that university students go over there sometimes to test their courage, but I've never heard about anyone dying since then. As for the snake, Paddy, I don't know much about that, but apparently there was an old folk tale about the ancestors of the elderly couple who owned the rice fields. They had a promise with a snake that they would dedicate some of the rice grown from their fields to it each year. I have a feeling there's a little more to it than just that though. So, after writing all this down, I got curious and decided to look into it further. Here's what I learned. My mother wouldn't tell me anything, and I didn't feel like any of the neighbours would talk either. So, I went to visit my junior high 3rd grade teacher, who lived in the next town over. He was a social studies teacher, who then became a vice principal. He retired just a few years ago, and now works for the city on a contract basis, compiling history. He has also published a book on local history for a newspaper company, so I thought maybe he might know something. I hadn't seen him in a while, so he was quite surprised when he heard what I wanted to know. He had apparently heard about what happened at the supermarket, and he told me a few other things that happened back then as well. There's a road in our town called the Old Road, and the houses on it have been there since long ago. A lot of the same families still live there, so it's not uncommon to see the same surname on many of them. At the end of the Old Road, which gradually rose up a hill, there was a small shrine dedicated to the village's guardian deity, and right in front of that shrine was the elderly couple's house. Apparently, that elderly couple were once members of a branch family, but they were then adopted into the main family. A former head of the main family was once a feudal lord who owned a rather large plot of land, and he leased much of this to the peasants. That branch family used to live on the plot that came to be known as the Snake Paddy, and it was quite a distance away from the old road. So, this branch family only had a small plot of land on which to farm rice. Their main business was a pharmacy, where they manufactured a type of tonic from snake's venom, probably from pit vipers. Once they were done with the snakes, their remains were tossed into a large hole near the shrine on the Snake Paddy, and they were highly revered in the village. Now, feel free to think of this following part as just an old wives' tale. I think the time period was around the end of the Edo period, and just before the start of the Meiji period. So, while the branch family lived well and had little problems in their daily life, they were still discriminated against by their relatives because their business involved killing. One day, a 10-year-old girl from the branch family went to play by the river with some of her relatives. Then, the eldest son from the head family suddenly came running back from the river, screaming that she had been swept downriver. Various villagers went to check it out, but they saw no sign of the girl. They then found her several days later downstream, naked. At the time, some boys were swimming naked in the river while the girls were collecting rocks on the riverbank. Then, they said, before they knew it, she vanished and was swept downstream. There were, of course, no detectives or anything there at the time, so it was chalked up to an unfortunate accident. But the girl's parents were unconvinced. There was no way their timid daughter would enter the river like that, they thought. And so, they went to ask the other children about what they were doing, but when they saw the parents in the village, they looked extremely uncomfortable and avoided them. At a loss for what to do, they called a child over from the same branch family to ask them about it. This child confessed that the boys didn't like the girl, so they pushed her into the river. Then, one after another, the children who were there that day started to die. None of these were unnatural deaths, but rather from a sudden illness that was common in those days. When the third boy in 2 years died, the head family finally decided to investigate why. They tried intimidation to get the branch family to end the curse, but the husband's resentment was so strong that not even beating him out of the village would make him stop. If they tried to turn him into the authorities, there was no proof that he had caused the children to die, and because education was spreading at the time, nobody would believe it was a curse either. As this was going on, one of the girls died. So, the head family got together to discuss matters, and they decided to adopt the younger brother of the girl who died, who was only 5, and bring him into the main family. They cried to the head of the branch family and asked him to stop. "Very well," he said with a harsh look on his face, and then withdrew. The next morning, he was found dead in the snake pit, face down and covered in countless snake corpses. The head family then destroyed the branch family's house, turning the land into a rice field, and forced them to quit making medicine. The wife then erected an altar where the snake pit had been and held a memorial service there. Eventually, the younger brother took over the main family, and they continued this memorial service all the way down to the elderly couple who died. And that was how the story went. Around the middle of the Meiji period, a scholar from Tokyo came to the village to interview people for a scientific journal, but upon hearing the story, said, "This is far too cruel to include in this city's history." "The snake Paddy is bad land," my old teacher said. I don't know if a man of learning such as myself should say this, but it's possible that the supermarket and the owner's fate had something to do with what happened in the past. You should stay away from there as well. This next story tells the tale of a certain burial mound that now functions as a shrine, although it's not your usual type of shrine. And fire is forbidden there. Why? Find out in Shrine That Was a Burial Mound. There's a small hill near our house that is entirely taken up by a shrine. There are no shrine grounds, only a stone mausoleum. There's a shrine gate at the foot of the hill, and this strange shrine was once a burial mound. Several academics have investigated the area, and judging by the shape of the mausoleum, they guess that it was an ancient burial mound. But it wasn't man-made. All they did was dig a hole into the hill. So why is it a shrine? Why are there no shrine grounds? Let me tell you. Have you ever heard the term Kunitsugami? There is a legend regarding this land. The legend speaks of the Kunitsugami, various earthly deities who were betrayed by the descendants of Amaterasu, taken prisoner, forced to surrender under threat that their families would be destroyed. And then, they were destroyed anyway. The way they killed them was by burning them to death. And so, this shrine was their tomb, and it used to be their castle. The descendants of Amaterasu tried to build a fortress on their castle remains, but the servants who climbed the hill died one after the other, as did precious construction workers, and then finally, the descendants as well. In a panic, the remaining descendants summoned a priestess to divine what was going on. "This place is filled with the resentment of the deities you betrayed," the priestess said. "You must return their castle and leave here." Then she took her last breath. Frightened, the descendants dedicated the remains of the hill to the fallen deities, and then left the land behind. The shrine became sacred land after that, and both fire and logging became forbidden. But even so, this hill sat in the middle of a plain, and so there was no end to the number of people who wanted to build their castle there. Yet each of them died in succession, and as time passed, the land became sacred and untouchable. In recent times, 20 years ago, one of my classmates was found dead at that shrine. He had been smoking a cigarette there, but when he was found, the flame had been long put out. He had just transferred to our school not even 6 months earlier. There are people in our village that devoutly pray at that shrine. They offer sake, play music, and they live in mansions at the foot of the hill. They are people that descend from the Kunitsugami themselves. But didn't they all die out, you say? Yes. They are the descendants of those who married different kami-sama, but chose to be descendants in order to soothe the wrath of their curse. The shrine and hill are surrounded by a wooden fence, and there are several signs hanging from it that state, "No entry" and "Fires forbidden." There is an iron fence in front of the shrine gate, and it's only opened for certain ceremonies that take place there. Japan loves hot springs, and you can find them all over. They're a nice, relaxing way to start or end the day. But what if you were a curious kid and you heard a local hot spring was haunted? You would want to visit, wouldn't you? Sometimes it really is best to heed those warnings. Find out why in The Hot Spring You Mustn't Enter. My hometown is famous for hot springs, but there's one hot spring in particular that is forbidden to enter. Apparently there was an accident there in the past when they were excavating or something. But anyway, this story takes place at that hot spring. I was attending university in the city at the time, and when I went back to my family home in the countryside for the holidays, I ran into my old friends, A, who had taken over his family farm, and B, who was also attending university elsewhere, but had come home for the holidays. We were childhood friends, but this was the first time we'd all gotten together since we turned 20, so we went out and drank long into the night. Around 2 a.m, as the night was starting to wind down and we were getting ready to say goodbye, I suddenly thought of that forbidden hot spring. I have no idea why. When we were in elementary school, A suggested that we go and check out the hot spring, so the three of us went over. Just as we were about to go inside, an old man in a truck saw us. He got out and started screaming at us. "You know you're not allowed to go in there! Didn't your parents tell you?" He then took us back down the mountain, made us call our parents, and they came to take us back home. My mother took me back and, of course, once we got home, my father yelled at me as well. But for whatever reason, I just couldn't accept that we weren't allowed to go in there, so I asked my mother a question just before bed. "When I grow up, can I go in there?" "When you're in university," she replied. Of course, she was no doubt just joking, but for some reason, I never forgot what she said. And for some reason, I really wanted to go there. It wasn't like I believed what my mother said back then, but I wanted to go on an adventure with my two friends again. I mentioned it as we were on our way home, and surprisingly, they agreed. They also wanted to go on an adventure like we did when we were kids. Moreover, according to A, that hot spring was no longer a taboo area like it used to be. The mountain roads had been redone, and several times a year tourists arrived and entered that hot spring. And, of course, nothing ever happened to them. People from the area always called to make sure. However, it would be a bit awkward to go there so late at night, so we agreed to meet during the day in 3 days' time, and then parted ways. On the day in question, we all met up at the foot of the mountain. Many of the trees had been cut down to make way for the asphalt road, so it was brighter and less creepy than it was when we were children. After walking about 2 kilometers, the road that led to the hot spring came into view. We ignored the sign that said, "Danger, do not enter," and kept going. There was another wooden sign with the hot spring name in faded letters, and then we arrived at a space that was probably used as the changing rooms. It was quite old and there were cobwebs everywhere. The footing was a mess as well. But the hot spring itself was still there and in great condition, and it was so clear you could just see across to the end of the water. However, the temperature wasn't being controlled, so it was rather hot, at maybe 50 or 60 degrees Celsius. It was way too hot to take a bath, so we decided to just dip our feet in instead. As we relaxed with our feet in the water, A told us about the hot spring's history and the strange phenomenon associated with it. In the past, there was a hot spring bubble, and so the town worked hard to build appropriate facilities to accommodate it. Construction was going well, but then one day there was an accident whilst they were excavating and several people were killed or injured. Work soon resumed and they were able to finish the project, but several more people were injured or fell ill during that time, and there were even reports of strange figures hanging around the construction site. Then, even though the hot spring opened for business, the strange occurrences continued. People reported something grabbing their legs under the water. Someone reported a man in work clothes entering the water, and when their eyes met, he felt faint and passed out. Some people reported the water temperature suddenly rising and they were unable to move, resulting in severe burns. Another person reported feeling a hand on their shoulder when they were washing their hair, but when they turned around, nobody was there. Some people were seriously injured while at the hot spring, so the town had no choice but to shut it down. But nothing strange happened while we were there, and several decades had passed since those strange incidents, so we laughed and figured that maybe the curse had weakened or was gone now, and then we left. But that night, as I was taking a bath, everything started to go wrong. I got in the bath and was relaxing like always. I was washing my hair when I noticed something about the bubbles felt strange. There was far too much foam considering the small amount of shampoo I had used. I wondered if maybe my mum had switched to a new type that foamed up well, but the bubbles kept increasing and increasing unnaturally. By the time I realized this, I opened my eyes and the foam was all over my face and throughout the bath. If you've ever been surrounded by foam, then you'll no doubt understand, but the pressure of it was like I couldn't breathe. I tried to reach the door, but I couldn't see, and my hand grasped at air. Then, when I finally found the door handle, it refused to open. I screamed for Mum and Dad, and I honestly thought my life was in danger. Then I kicked at the door, trying to open it with my own power. At that moment, something grabbed my legs and pulled me away from the door. The hand was cold and, no doubt about it, it was coming from the bathtub. Our bathtub was only just big enough for me to fit in, but I remember that hand pulling me for an awfully long time. I don't know where that hand was trying to take me, but my father heard my screams and came running. He found me lying unconscious in the bathroom, but according to him, there was no foam or anything else in the bathroom either. Just me. About an hour later, after I regained consciousness, I was convinced that that hot spring really was cursed. I contacted A and B immediately, and although I got through to A, something terrible was happening at B's house. His younger sister told me that he'd fallen and hit his head in the bathroom and was unconscious. We rushed over to the hospital and spent the night there, but B remained unconscious all night. The next day, he died. He woke up during the day and was able to respond to a few questions, but his condition worsened as night fell, and then he passed away. I told A about what happened to me, and no doubt about it, this was a curse. I called A the previous night before he'd gone to take a bath, so that probably saved him, but he agreed that this was likely a curse. He also heard something terrifying from B's younger sister. Apparently, when we visited the hot spring and put our feet in, something had grabbed B's leg. He didn't say anything to us at the time because he didn't want to worry us. A and I felt responsible for what had happened to him. A for telling us that the area was no longer taboo, and me for suggesting we go in the first place. In the end, it was B, who had nothing to do with the hot spring, who had died. We weren't quite sure how his family would react, so we decided to keep quiet about it until the time was right. However, B's sister must have told someone where we went, because it wasn't long until rumours of the hot spring being cursed started to spread again. And of course, my parents, who saved me from the bath that day, heard them too. They pestered me until I finally confessed that, yes, we went to the hot spring that day. Then A's family, B's family, my family, and the Hot Spring Association all gathered for a meeting. B's mother stared at us with hatred in her eyes, and as soon as the meeting began, the chairman from the Hot Spring Association started screaming at us. "We told you never to go in there!" According to the people from the association, the curse of that hot spring wasn't weakening, but rather growing stronger, and it was because tourists kept entering it. The tourists claimed that it was like something pulled them in, and next thing they knew, they were inside. The name of that hot spring in the old local dialect meant something like second time, again, meaning that if you dropped by the hot spring a second time, then you would fall victim to its curse. I don't know whether it was B's first or second time there, but he must have done something to upset the spirits, the chairman said. My mother then said something shocking. When we tried to visit the hot spring when we were kids, that old man in the truck stopped us. Yet, that man clearly wasn't a local, and my mother had never seen him around before. A and B's parents were also suspicious of him at the time. The members of the association got together to talk, and then they looked at photos of people who had died at that hot spring, and they found a man there who looked just like the man in the truck. "He went to all the trouble of warning you not to go in there, and yet..." My mother burst into tears. According to the members of the Hot Spring Association, the best way to deal with the curse was to never approach the area again, and to carry a vial of purified water with me, not just when I took a bath, but whenever I approached dangerous areas of water as well. My parents and I readied ourselves to leave the area. That's pretty much the end of the story. A also wanted to leave, but his parents complained, stating their family had been farmers for generations and there was no way they could survive in the city. And so, in the end, he had to stay behind. He tried to avoid the gazes of others, and he felt responsible for B's death, so I guess the pressure piled up for him. We met a few times outside our hometown, and I could tell just by looking at him that he was going through a rough time. I tried to cheer him up and remind him not to blame himself for B's death, but he wasn't the type to talk about his problems, so I don't think I got very far with him. I wondered what was going to happen to him if matters continued like this, but I was also in the middle of looking for work, so for the next year, I was unable to see him. Then, just as I found work and was getting ready to see him again, I received word that he had taken his own life. Naturally, I wasn't allowed to attend his funeral, but I heard that he did it in the bath. I don't know if he had that vial of purified water with him though. But if A had chosen to do that by himself, then I don't know if it had anything to do with the curse. If he had died in the bath like something was pulling him in, then that most definitely would have been the curse. Whatever the circumstances leading up to their deaths, I had lost 2 of my closest friends. It was I who triggered the incident, and B who paid for it. And it was I who was able to escape, while A was left behind and then died. Thanks to that vial, not a lot of strange things happen around me anymore, but recently, I feel like the spirits of A and B have cursed me more than the spirits of the hot spring. I don't even know if that hot spring is still around anymore. Our last story for this week sees a man heading into the mountains for some research. On this particular day, he passes through a village on his way up and meets quite the frosty reception. This doesn't change on his way back either. What's really going on here, and why do the villagers seem to hate and fear him so much? Find out why in Village at the Foot of the Mountain. This happened long ago. A close friend of mine, who was super smart, had a part-time job that allowed him to pursue his hobby at the same time, climbing mountains, where he then did research. One day, he climbed the mountain using a path that passed through a village at the foot of the mountain. There were a few houses on the way, and the people there were unusually hostile. They ran when they saw him. They glared at him from the shadows. The children ran at the sight of him. Adults grabbed their playing children to drag them inside. So on and so forth. Something didn't feel right, and so he hurried along. When he was done with work for the day, he returned back down that same path to join up with the rest of the researchers. Are they going to act like they did on my way up? He thought. But as he was walking back down, he suddenly felt ill. His body hurt, it was hard to breathe, and he felt faint. He hurried down the mountain, but his condition grew worse, and by the time he reached the village, he could barely walk. He approached the first house he saw to get some help, but there was no response, even though there appeared to be people inside. He went to the next house, but when the residents out in the garden saw him, they suddenly all rushed inside and slammed the door in his face. He walked over and called out, "Excuse me, I don't feel so well. Could you let me rest here a moment? Could I please get some water? Or if you could lend me your phone?" No answer. He waited a few more moments, and then someone from inside screamed, "We're not coming out!" He banged on the door again. "Please!" Then he heard a woman's voice coming from inside. "This person, he might be different." Then the door opened. It appeared he passed out, because next thing he knew, he was lying on the floor. The residents of the house treated him very kindly. Oh my, we're so sorry. We mistook you for someone else," they said, looking extremely apologetic. According to the villagers, in this particular village, there was a certain man who appeared to climb the mountain once every 2 years. He always wore the same clothes with the same equipment, and he apparently looked just like him. No, you are him. My friend was confused. This was his first time at this village. At any rate, they continued, and the problem was what came after that. Apparently, this mountain climber who looked exactly like my friend, whenever he visited the village or the area nearby, someone always died shortly thereafter. It happened every single time, so everyone grew to fear him and ran away when they saw him. But that climber never came down the same path he took up. Villagers used to greet him and even ask him a few questions, but he never replied and always ignored them. There was nothing they could do. And this was why the villagers acted like that when they saw him. After that, one of the villagers drove my friend to the station in his light truck. When he asked his company about what he heard at the village the following day, they said, "We've never heard anything like that." His ill health that day would later down the track cause him some big problems, but that's another story for another time. A massive thank you and shout out to this week's Cummy tier members, Nocturne and Christina. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this show, so thank you very much. Don't forget to pick up Kowabana Volume 10, available on Amazon right now, and check out our newly revamped merchandise store at kowabana.store. And if you'd like to chat about this week's stories, come and join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys. Stay safe and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.